To sew your fly front zipper, you will need to have a right front and left front to your pant. Right and left are designated by which side is on the right and left when the garment is being worn. You will also need a fly shield, a fly facing, and a 4-inch zipper. Let's begin by prepping our fly shield. We want to use the iron to press it in half lengthwise across the point marked by the notches. So I'm just going to fold it in half, bring the edges together, and use the iron to press a crease down the center. Next, we'll need our right and left fronts. When we indicate something as right and left on a garment, that means the right and left when the garment is finished and being worn by the person. I've indicated right and left on the outside or correct side of the garment. So I'm going to begin by placing those together. And the first thing we're going to sew will be the crotch seam. We're going to begin at this little bottom of the J-shaped curve here, and we're not going to stitch all the way to the top, but rather we're just going to sew from this point up to where the notches are at 1/2 inch seam allowance, and we'll be back stitching at both ends. This first step of sewing the crotch seam can be done with a standard presser foot, but I already have my machine equipped with a zipper foot because we will need the zipper foot on for the remaining steps, so it's fine to be on for this portion as well. I'm going to position my fabric underneath and make sure I'm on my 1/2 inch line over here. We'll begin with a back stitch and then come forward around the curve at that 1/2 inch right up to where that notch is, at which point we will back stitch. Take your fabric shears and right where the notch is and your stitch line ends, you're going to clip inwards right up to where those stitches are without actually cutting them. Then open up your garment, and on the right front, you're going to take your zipper now, unzip it, flip it over so that the zipper is upside down, as in the right side of the zipper against the right side of the fabric. Align your zipper tape with the crotch seam of the right front. You want to match the top of the tape at the top of the pant front, as well as matching the tape along the edge going lengthwise. While it's in this position, you will also bring in your fly shield that you've already pressed in half. You want to take not the folded side, but the raw edge side and place that on top of everything, also aligning the edges. So the zipper is now sandwiched between the fly shield and the right pant front, and the zipper is facing down against it. With all of these edges aligned, place a few pins to hold everything together. I'm just going to pin perpendicularly at a couple points. We have a lot of layers here, so it will help to have some pins. The zipper pull is down at the bottom now because it's open, but partway through our sewing, we're going to stop and zip it up to the top to get it out of the way. And we'll do similar practices anytime we're sewing down the length of the zipper so that we don't get a wobbly, wavy line from going past it. So for now, just pin to a little bit above where that zipper pull is placed. With everything sandwiched in this position, we're going to be stitching down at 1/4 inch seam allowance through all the layers. And when we get to the bottom here, we want to be sure to stop exactly where our clip is and finish with a back stitch. So I'm going to start a little ways down from the top to leave room for a back stitch, but be sure that I'm on my 1/4 inch guideline on the right side. Having the zipper foot allows my normal presser foot to not get in the way of the zipper as we sew. So right about here, as we're getting close to where the zipper pull is, stop, zip it up to the top to get it out of the way, and that will allow everything to lay nice and flat towards the end. You can even take the other side of the pant front here and fold it down so that everything sits nice and flat. But be sure you know where that clip is, because that's exactly where we want to stop sewing. Be sure you finish with a back stitch. After sewing the seam to attach the fly shield, we want to take the shield and flip it and the zipper open now. And you want to feel that your seam allowance is going towards your right front of your pant here, because now we're going to follow up by edge stitching about a 1/16 of an inch over, and you want to be stitching through the seam allowance and the zipper tape underneath. Without having to change the direction in which your zipper foot is placed, if it's oriented so that you can only sew to one side or the other, we're instead going to come in from the bottom to do this so that we're still stitching at an optimum spacing. So starting from the bottom now, I'm going to be edge stitching a 1/16 of an inch over from the seam. I'll start with a tiny little back stitch, not going past the clip. And then also finish with a little back stitch at the top as well. Next, we're going to come to our left front. We want to also bring in our fly facing now and take the long straight side, as in not the curved side, and align it with the crotch seam of the left front. Here's where I made my little clip here, so it almost helps to have that pulled out as you match these up. Make sure that the fly facing is lined up with the left front at the top as well as along this side. And we're going to be stitching these two pieces together at 1/2 inch seam allowance. And we want to be sure to not sew past our little clipped seam allowance underneath. We want to stop exactly at that point when we finish with our back stitch. It almost helps to then, once you have it positioned like this, grab the 2 layers of fabric and flip it over. That way we can see exactly where to stop sewing when we're at that clip. Make sure everything is sitting nice and flat at the bottom here, and be sure to stop right at the clip. After sewing the fly facing to the left front, go to the iron and fold your fly facing open so that you are now pressing the seam allowance of that seam towards the facing completely. You may want to even open it up and pull everything else out of the way so that you can isolate that seam and not press over the zipper. But don't have your press go beyond this point because we don't want to end up with any ugly folds down there. We're going to follow up by understitching this seam as well, meaning stitching a 1/16 of an inch over from the seam so that we are stitching the seam allowance to the fly facing. And we want to end exactly where our seam ends at the bottom. After understitching, flip your sample over and grab that fly facing to pull it through to the wrong side. See how I pull that little tab through? And now we're going to give another press right along the seam edge to keep the fly facing towards the wrong side of the garment. Fold your sample in half to bring the right sides of the right and left together. And we want to come over here to our fly shield as well as our fly facing. We want to have them both unfolded, and you want to match the edge of the fly facing to the folded edge of the fly shield. Have those nice and aligned right on here, and without letting that move or shift from this position, fold the fly shield back and away, and you want to grab the other side of the zipper tape and pin it onto the fly facing. We want to be sure that this doesn't shift out of alignment. This is what helps our fly sit in place properly. So you should see an even measurement of extra fabric sticking out past the edge of the zipper tape. Use a few pins to secure the tape to the fly facing in that position. We're going to be stitching the zipper tape to the fly facing, but we're not going to have to stitch really close to the zipper. Instead, we're going to stitch kind of close to the edge of the tape all the way down the length of it. With my zipper tape pinned to my fly shield, we're now going to be stitching close to the edge of the zipper tape all the way up. When we get near the top where our zipper pull is, we'll want to stop and unzip it to get it out of the way so that we can continue nice and straight all the way to the top without our stitch going off track. So starting all the way from the bottom of both the facing and the zipper tape, we're going to begin with a back stitch. And I'm just stitching about 1/8 of an inch in from the zipper tape. Right about here, as we're close to our zipper pull, stop, make sure your needle is down so you can lift your presser foot. And we want to be sure for this remaining portion that we have the tape positioned nice and straight and in alignment with the same position we've previously had. So your fabric over here should look evenly spaced down the whole length as we now continue to sew all the way up to the tippy top and finish with a back stitch. Our next step will be top stitching on the outside of the left front to sew the left front onto just the fly facing underneath. This is what you commonly see on jeans from the outside of the garment, which comes as a straight line that curves inward toward the crotch seam. We're going to give ourselves a nice little guideline ahead of time so that we have something to follow as we sew. For the main straight portion, we want to mark 1 inch over from the crotch seam on the left front. And we want to draw this line just to where our opening ends. Then, from that point, measure down exactly 1/2 inch right at the crotch seam and give yourself a little horizontal mark. For the remaining portion, you're going to sort of freehand a little curve that comes up and connects smoothly to our 1 inch line that we already have drawn. You'll want to have your zipper unzipped for this part because we don't want to end up sewing through to the fly shield underneath. You only want to be stitching the left front onto the fly facing underneath. So now, being sure that I have my right front folded completely out of the way, I want to be stitching along my guideline, sewing through the left front and the fly facing only. I can even grab this part right here and completely flip it down and away. When you get near the bottom, stop and zip your zipper closed and double check that your fly shield on the other side is completely out of the way as you come around the curve. Come right up to the crotch seam and finish with a small back stitch. As a final step, to keep the fly shield from flapping around on the inside of the garment, you want to come to this lower curved corner of your top stitching, fold the left front back, and underneath you'll see a little exposed edge of the fly facing. We're going to be doing just a little tack to stitch the fly facing onto the fly shield underneath. So right close to the edge here, we're just going to do a quick little forward, back, forward to anchor that curved raw edge onto our folded fly shield underneath. So I'm just going to pull this back, and right here, about 1/8 of an inch in from the edge, just do a quick little forward backward, forward, backward, to tack them together. When finished, present your sample in your notebook with the right side facing up. A welt-bound pocket is an elegant pocket that's typically found on dress garments like suit jackets. The one that we're going to be sewing will have a single welt as opposed to the also known double welt pocket. To sew your welt pocket, you will need a rectangle marked with drill holes to indicate pocket placement. This rectangle is just meant to indicate the outside of the garment. You will also need 2 pocket bags. Notice the difference in size between the two. One is about a 1/2 inch longer, so take note of that as we move on to the following steps. And finally, you will need this rectangle of fabric, which will become the welt. For our first step, we're going to be taking the welt, folding it in half lengthwise with the right sides together, and we will stitch at 1/4 inch seam allowance down both of the short edges, back stitching at both ends. Next, take your welt and you want to turn it right side out. Push out the corners, nice and sharp. And then use the iron to press it. You want to be sure to press the seams at the ends, as well as align the straight edges on the bottom so that you get a nice even fold across the length. Next, we're going to be placing our welt onto our rectangle that indicates the body of the garment. We want to match this center notch with the center drill hole, and we're aligning the raw edges of the welt with the entire row of drill holes, with the folded end pointed downward toward the larger portion of the rectangle. With your welt in this position, we want to really help it stay in place, so let's put a couple pins, just maybe one at each end, but backed away from the raw edge by a bit so they don't interfere with our sewing. Next, take the smaller of your 2 pocket bags, and we want to place it with the pocket bag also extending downward, match the center notch to the center notch, and align the raw edges of everything together. Then we'll bring in the other pocket bag, the larger one, and place it with the raw edge matching the raw edge of the other pocket bag, matching the center notches. So these 2 pocket bags are basically just kissing in the middle. The larger one is folded upwards. With everything in this position, add a couple more pins, way kind of out on the perimeter of everything. We're going to be making a pencil mark, and we don't want them interfering with our ruler and pencil's ability to mark accurately. We're going to be stitching a very skinny rectangle right across this area where the 2 pocket bags are meeting. So we want to first draw a 1/4 inch line on either side of that point at which they meet. So 1/4 inch in this direction, and then a 1/4 inch on this side as well. These will be the long sides of our rectangle. And on either end here, you're going to draw a short line to close off the rectangle exactly where you feel the edge of your welt sitting underneath. So right here, I can even kind of push my ruler right up against that little ledge and mark a short line, and do the same thing up here. Now that we have our marks done, let's add a couple more pins to these corners to hold everything steady in the area that we're about to sew. And we're going to be stitching exactly on this line to follow this long, skinny, rectangular shape. Rather than starting exactly at any of the corners, we're going to start a little ways down. Sometimes starting and finishing at a corner on a welt pocket like this ends up getting to be a little bit messy there. So we're going to begin right about here, pivot at the corners, and come all the way around to overlap where we started from by a little bit. So I'm going to start on my line a little ways down from that first corner, but I'll be stitching directly on it. Make sure you come exactly up to the corner, have your needle down, and then raise your presser foot to pivot. As we come down the short ends of the rectangle, we drew that little guideline exactly where we feel the welt sitting underneath, but your goal as you sew over this little portion here is to be as close as possible to the welt, but without actually catching it in your stitches. So you're kind of sewing off the ledge created by the welt by a little bit. And now we'll pivot and come across the other long side. And on this corner, we'll do the same thing, where we want to be sure that we are off of the actual welt. And be sure to not stitch on it at all as we come forward. Pivot at the final corner. And now we're coming around to where we started. So you just want to overlap that starting point by about a ½ inch or so, sewing directly on the stitches you already have to close the loop. Next, we're going to be cutting through the actual rectangle below our pocket bags. We want to cut exactly where these edges of the pocket bag meet. So to do that, I'm going to sort of just fold it in half to get it started with a snip right in the middle. So now you see we've actually cut through all layers and we have a hole coming through everything. Continue cutting on that center line towards either end, but you want to stop this cut about a ½ inch from the short side of your rectangular stitching. And from this point, you will do a diagonal clip that angles out to the corner of your stitches. Once on this side, and the same thing on this one. So come as close as you can to the actual stitches without actually cutting them. Turn it around and do the same thing in the other direction. So we'll just continue this cut down the center, stop about a ½ inch from the short side of the rectangle, and diagonal clip out to the corner, and out to the corner. Then take your pocket bag pieces. Right now this is the right side of the garment. We're going to be pushing these both through the hole that we've just cut to the other side so that they end up on the wrong side of the garment. So just shove them through the hole. Your welt will stay on the right side though, so let that be. And as we flip this over to the wrong side, where we've now pushed our pockets through, we're going to be doing a little pressing. So see how I kind of pull this open, and you want to have a nice clean rectangular seam now that you can see. So check out your corners here, and you want to be looking to see if you have any puckering going on at them. Sometimes you could just kind of gently pull the fabric and have them resolve, but if you do have a lot of puckers still at these corners, then that means you'll need to turn the pocket back out and clip a little bit deeper. It means your diagonal clips didn't get quite close enough to the stitches. But with everything in this position, we want to be pressing along the short sides of the seam as well as this lower one on the side of the shorter pocket bag, the one that's pointed towards the rectangle. So get a nice clean press on the short edge, really kind of pull the excess fabric downward to press this lower seam. Okay. And then pull it open and get along the other short side here. Okay. Then you're going to take the other pocket bag. I call this the upper one because right now our sample is upside down. So as I flip it around, this is the upper pocket bag, the larger one. We want to fold this down. You should see now that the pocket bags will align along the whole lower edge. While it's in this position, take this seam allowance here and push it downward toward the pocket bag and press it in place. As we flip our pocket to the right side of the garment now, you should have your welt extending straight up and outward, and all the seams should look nice and clean and rectangular. Our next step is going to be edge stitching the sides of the pocket flap down. See, right now it can still kind of flap open a little bit. Traditionally, to give this a really clean finish on more expensive garments, it would actually be stitched by hand because you get a more invisible finish. But we're going to be edge stitching about 1/16 of an inch in from the welt edge, all the way from the top fold down to the bottom seam. And we'll do this on both sides. I'm just going to bring my pocket in here, and for this particular edge stitching, we're going to be stitching 1/16 of an inch in from the short edge. I like to work from the seam side of the pocket upwards towards the fold. That keeps everything moving a little bit flatter and prevents it from getting scrunched downward, which is what could happen if you sew at the folded or loose end of it first. So I want to be sure I have this pulled right over to where my opening is. And we want to have a little nice clean little back stitch at the beginning and end. So I want to get my edge stitch aligned, but begin sewing a little ways down from the upper seam here so that I can start by going backwards just 3 stitches to it. And now I'll continue forward with my edge stitch spacing until I just drop off the bottom folded edge of the pocket. And now I'll go in reverse for 3 or 4 stitches. And now we'll repeat the same thing on the other side. The final step of our welt pocket will be to close up the pocket bag on the inside. So I'm going to flip it over to the wrong side, and if all has gone well, then the edges of both your pocket bags should be pretty well aligned right now. We'll still add a few pins around the perimeter just to help hold it in place, but we're going to be stitching around the pocket bag at 1/2 inch seam allowance. But we don't want to be stitching it onto the rectangle, so we'll want to be sure to pull this away as we do our sewing. Maybe along the curved corner at the bottom, we'll add a couple pins. And on a small sample like this, that should be good enough. So we want to be sure that this is all out of the way and that you just grab the 2 edges of the pocket bag. You could even fold the side of the rectangle back as we start to sew. We're going to be sewing at 1/2 inch seam allowance starting from the top, and we'll just creep all the way around the bottom of the pocket bag up to the other side. So I want to be sure to grab just the 2 layers of the pocket bag and fold the excess of the rectangle out of the way. Starting at the top, we'll begin with a back stitch, and we're on 1/2 inch seam allowance as we come all the way around the pocket bag. As we come on to the top, be sure you also have the rectangle folded out of the way. Don't catch it in any of your stitches as you come right to the end and backstitch. Once completed, your pocket should look nice and clean from the outside with no stitches of the actual pocket bag coming through. Double check that it opens up at the top at the welt. Ah, success. Place your completed pocket in your notebook with the right side facing up.